Have you ever noticed how your mind can feel loud, even when nothing around you is happening, as if the real noise is not in the room but inside you, built from things you keep carrying that were never fully yours to carry in the first place? That is where so much inner tension begins. You replay conversations that already ended. You rehearse futures that have not happened. You absorb other people's moods as if your peace must rise and fall with theirs. And, little by little, your inner life fills with urgency, pressure, and conflict, until calm starts feeling distant even on quiet days. Stoicism begins with a harder truth, but also a freeing one. Peace does not come from finally controlling the world around you. It comes from learning how to govern what is still yours, your attention, your judgment, your response, and the way you speak to yourself when life becomes uncertain. That is where a quiet mind begins, not in escape, not in perfection, but in disciplined return, and that return starts with the first distinction that changes everything. 1. Know what is yours to carry. There are days when you are not exhausted because life asked too much of you, but because your mind kept volunteering for burdens that were never yours in the first place. You wake up and start carrying someone else's mood, someone else's silence, someone else's confusion, someone else's opinion of you, and before the day has even properly begun, your inner world already feels crowded. Then the future joins in, then the past. Then the mind starts dragging in unfinished conversations, imagined outcomes, old regrets and private fears, until you are no longer just living your life. You are carrying a whole invisible weight, made of things you cannot actually govern. This is one of the deepest reasons the mind becomes loud. It keeps treating everything as if it were personal responsibility. Not practical responsibility, but emotional ownership. And those are not the same thing. Practical responsibility asks, what is mine to do here? Emotional ownership asks, how do I carry all of this inside me? The first creates action, the second creates strain. A quiet mind begins when that confusion starts to break. You were never meant to govern the past. You can learn from it, answer for what was yours, repair what can still be repaired, but you cannot enter it again and reshape it into something that hurts less. You were never meant to govern other people's reactions either. You can speak honestly, act cleanly, set boundaries, apologize when needed, and still not be able to control what another person chooses to feel, believe, or remember. And you were never meant to govern uncertain outcomes by rehearsing them over and over in your head, as if worry were a form of preparation. The mind loves that illusion. It tells you that if you think about something long enough, you are somehow protecting yourself. In reality, you are often only exhausting yourself in advance. What remains then? Your judgment, your conduct, your response, your next action, the tone you take with yourself, the standard you live by when things are unclear. That is the territory that still belongs to you. And when you return to it, something in the mind begins to settle, because it no longer has to manage the entire world in order to feel safe. This is the Stoic shift in its most practical form. Not indifference, not emotional numbness, just clear ownership. This part is mine. This part is not. That sentence can rescue a day faster than most people realize. Think about how much suffering begins by confusing influence with control. You may influence a conversation, but you do not control how it lands. You may influence your future, but you do not control how every result unfolds. You may influence a relationship, but you do not control whether another person grows, stays, understands, or changes. Peace does not arrive when you finally learn how to manage all of that. Peace begins when you stop demanding that your nervous system carry what reality never placed in your hands. And that is not passivity, it is relief. Because the moment you stop treating every loose end as your duty, attention returns. You can finally ask better questions. what is actually mine to do right now? What belongs to my character here? What response leaves me clean inside, even if the outcome stays uncertain? Those questions do not make life easy, but they make it governable. And a governable life feels very different from a mentally overcrowded one. You can feel this in ordinary moments. Someone is disappointed in you. The loud mind says, fix their feelings. The quieter mind says, tell the truth, stay respectful, and let them have their response. A plan is uncertain. The loud mind says, run every future until you feel safe. The quieter mind says, do the next honest thing and stop trying to control what has not happened. A memory returns. The loud mind says, go back and suffer it again. The quieter mind says, learn what is yours and leave the rest where time already put it. This is not a one-time realization, it is a daily correction. The mind will keep reaching beyond its rightful place because that is what anxious minds do. They overreach, they overcarry, they confuse vigilance with wisdom. So your task is not to become perfect at this overnight. Your task is to keep returning, again and again, until the question becomes instinctive. Is this mine to carry, or am I adding weight that does not belong to me? That question protects peace, because once you stop carrying what was never yours, you do not become careless. You become clearer, you become more present, more capable, less divided. Your energy stops leaking into places where it cannot produce anything but tension, and starts gathering where it can still become judgment, conduct, and action. Inner peace begins there, not in having less to face, but in facing only what is truly yours. And once that becomes clearer, the next step follows naturally, because it is not enough to know what is yours to carry. You also have to learn how to act well without emotionally chaining yourself to the result. 2. Act well without clinging to the result. A great deal of mental suffering begins the moment your peace stops living in your actions and starts living in outcomes, because once that shift happens, the mind abandons the present and runs ahead into a future it cannot control, then keeps returning with fear, urgency, and imagined consequences until even a simple task feels emotionally heavy. You are no longer just doing what needs to be done. You are dragging the weight of what if it fails? What if it is not enough? What if it does not work? What if I do all of this and still do not get what I hoped for into the moment with you? And that is how even honest effort starts feeling tense. This is where anxiety quietly takes over. Not always because life is objectively impossible, but because the mind has attached identity to a result that has not arrived yet. It is no longer just trying to act well. It is trying to secure worth, safety, validation, certainty, and emotional relief through an ending it does not fully command. That is too much weight for any action to carry. A quieter mind learns a different posture. It learns to respect the action more than the fantasy around it. That does not mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means you stop handing your nervous system over to them. You still prepare, you still work, you still try to do things well, but you no longer make the result the condition for inner stability. You stop saying, I can only be okay if this works exactly the way I want. And the moment that sentence loses power, the present becomes usable again. Think about how often the mind leaves the work in front of it and runs to the end of the story. You are writing, but mentally you are already wondering how it will be received. You are speaking, but inwardly you are already reacting to how you might be judged. You are building something, but the mind is no longer with the work. It is trying to guarantee success before the process has even been honored. This is one of the fastest ways to lose peace, because you cannot do clean work while emotionally kneeling before a future that has not happened. The calmer path is simpler, but harder on the ego. You bring yourself back to the next honest action, not the imagined ending, not the final reward, not the fear of loss. just the next piece that is still yours. That shift changes the whole emotional texture of life. Instead of asking, will this work? Will this be enough? Will this give me what I want? You begin asking, what is the most truthful action available to me right now? What can I do well in this moment without demanding a guarantee from the future? Those questions steady the mind because they return it to something real, something livable, something actionable. This is where Stoic discipline becomes deeply practical. It does not ask you to stop caring. It asks you to stop becoming enslaved to results you cannot fully govern. You act with seriousness, but without handing over your peace. You do what is yours, and you let reality answer in its own time. That sounds simple until life tests it. You send the message and cannot control the reply. You prepare and cannot control the reaction. You give your best and cannot control the recognition. You love and cannot control the return. You choose well and still cannot control every consequence. That is not failure. That is the human condition. And the mind becomes much quieter when it stops treating uncertainty like an insult. The truth is, the next honest action is often more powerful than 10 imagined futures, because imagined futures create pressure, while honest action creates movement. Pressure tightens the mind. Movement steadies it. Pressure makes you stare at outcomes until you become mentally paralyzed. Movement keeps you inside reality long enough to build something real. This is also why clinging feels so exhausting. Clinging is the mind trying to grip what has not yet formed. It turns effort into tension and hope into demand. Then, even good work becomes heavy because you are no longer just doing it. You are trying to force life to promise you something before it is ready to promise anything at all. A quieter mind refuses that bargain. It says, I will act well, I will stay present, I will return to the work in front of me, but I will not spend today trying to emotionally possess tomorrow. That is not detachment in the cold sense, it is emotional sobriety. And once you practice this, something changes in your body too. You breathe differently. You rush less. You stop panicking inside unfinished things. You become more available to the work itself, which often improves the result anyway. Not because you obsessed harder, but because you finally stopped abandoning the present in order to chase the future. So if you want more inner peace, stop asking the next action to also guarantee the ending. Let the action be enough for now. Let the result arrive later. Let your mind stay where your hands still have influence. Because a calmer life is not built by controlling the whole story in advance. It is built by returning again and again to what can be done cleanly now. And if this point is speaking to where you are in life, take a second to like the video and write in the comments, I return to the next right action. And once you start living that way, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. A rushed life always creates a rushed mind. 3. Slow down so the mind can become governable. A rushed life teaches the mind a dangerous lesson, that everything is urgent. Everything must be answered immediately. Every delay is a threat. Every pause is wasted time, and every moment of stillness should be filled before it turns into discomfort. Once that lesson settles in, speed stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like identity. You walk fast, think fast, answer fast, worry fast, react fast, and after a while you do not even notice that your mind is no longer moving with clarity. It is moving with pressure. That pressure is one of the hidden enemies of inner peace, because the mind cannot govern itself well when it is constantly being hurried. It can survive that way. It can function that way. It can even become productive in short bursts that make the outside world think you are doing fine. But beneath that surface, something important begins to break down. Thought becomes shallow. Judgment becomes reactive. Attention becomes fragmented. You stop fully inhabiting what you are doing because the mind is already moving to the next thing before the present thing has even finished landing inside you. This is why so many people feel mentally loud, even on quiet days. The room may be still, but the pace inside them is not. Their nervous system has been trained to live in forward motion, so even silence feels like pressure. They sit down to rest, and the mind starts scanning. They try to think clearly, and the thoughts come too quickly to be sorted. They try to be present in a conversation, but part of them is already reaching toward what comes next. This is what a rushed inner life feels like. It is not only speed, it is the loss of depth that speed creates. And depth is exactly what peace needs. A quiet mind does not come from squeezing more control out of the day. It comes from moving at a pace your nervous system can actually live inside without constantly feeling hunted. That does not mean becoming passive, slow in a performative way, or detached from responsibility. It means refusing to let urgency become your default emotional posture. It means not treating every task like an emergency, every message like a demand, every uncertainty like something that must be resolved before you can breathe again. The mind becomes governable when it has enough space to see clearly. That space disappears when you rush through everything. You stop observing. You stop digesting. You stop noticing what is actually happening inside you because the speed of life becomes a shield against awareness. And sometimes people secretly like that shield because slowing down means they will have to feel things they have been outrunning. They will have to notice their tension, their scattered attention, their irritability, the way they have been living on stimulation instead of steadiness. So they keep the pace high and call it productivity, when often it is avoidance wearing professional clothes. But the cost of that avoidance is steep. When life is too fast, the smallest disruption feels larger than it is because there is no inner margin left. A delayed message irritates you more. A small mistake follows you longer. A conversation lingers in your body. A task feels heavier than it should. Not because the world suddenly got harder, but because your system has no room left to absorb ordinary friction. Everything starts landing on an already crowded mind. Slowing down restores that room. It changes how thoughts arrive. It changes how reactions unfold. It gives you a chance to notice yourself before your habits take over. You hear the sharp reply forming and choose not to send it yet. You feel anxiety rising and do not immediately obey it. You notice the urge to rush ahead mentally and decide to stay where your body actually is. These are small acts, but together they change the pace of your inner life. And once the pace changes, your judgments become steadier. You stop making so many decisions from agitation. This is why pace is not a small detail. Pace is psychological architecture. The speed at which you live affects the quality of the mind that must live there. You can feel this in ordinary moments. Eating too fast, walking too fast, responding before you understand what you feel, filling every silence with noise, treating the day like something you are trying to outrun. None of these things look dramatic by themselves, but together they teach the nervous system that life is a constant demand. Once that becomes normal, peace starts feeling foreign, and a foreign state is hard to trust. So part of Stoic discipline is not only controlling judgment, but slowing the conditions under which judgment is made. A calmer pace does not guarantee wisdom, but it gives wisdom a chance to enter. It allows thought to deepen before it becomes speech. It allows emotion to settle before it becomes action. It allows the mind to distinguish between what is happening and what it is merely projecting. Sometimes that slowing down is external. You answer later. You walk without your phone. You do one thing at a time. You stop crowding every hour. But often it is internal first. You take one breath before responding. You refuse to let one stressful moment infect the next. You stop speaking to yourself in the language of emergency when nothing is actually on fire. That matters more than people realize, because peace is not only built by what you think, it is built by the speed at which you let yourself think it. A mind given no margin becomes harsh, reactive, and easily overwhelmed. A mind given enough rhythm becomes more accurate, less frightened, and less likely to turn every uncertainty into inner noise. You do not need a perfectly peaceful life to begin practicing this. You only need moments where you stop agreeing to unnecessary haste, moments where you let the body catch up to the day, moments where you choose not to make your inner world run at the speed of your pressure. A quieter mind often begins there, not with a breakthrough, but with a different pace. Because peace needs a rhythm the nervous system can trust. And when life keeps moving too fast for the mind to stay rooted, even simple days begin to feel like conflict. So slow down enough to become readable to yourself again. Slow down enough to hear what your mind is doing. Slow down enough to respond, not just react. And once you do that, another responsibility becomes clear, because slowing the pace helps, but it is not enough if you keep feeding the mind agitation all day long. 4. Guard what enters your mind. You can feel this one most clearly at the end of a day when nothing terrible happened, and yet your mind feels dirty, restless, overactive, and strangely heavy, as if it has been carrying emotional residue from things that were never truly yours, but still found a way inside you through repetition, through what you watched, what you listened to, what you scrolled past, what you absorbed in conversation, what you laughed at, what you tolerated, what you kept exposing yourself to long after you knew it was making your inner life noisier instead of clearer. That is the part many people underestimate. They think peace is mostly lost through their own thoughts, while forgetting that thoughts do not grow in a vacuum. They grow in atmosphere. They take shape inside whatever the mind keeps touching. A person can spend the whole day feeding on urgency, outrage, comparison, gossip, overstimulation, and emotional chaos, and then still wonder at night why silence feels uncomfortable and why the mind will not settle. But the mind is only continuing what it has been trained to continue. This is why a quiet mind requires more than reflection. It requires filters. Not every conversation deserves a place in you. Not every piece of content deserves your attention. Not every environment deserves daily access to your nervous system. Some inputs leave you clearer, steadier, more honest, more present. Others leave you agitated, distracted, dissatisfied, suspicious, or subtly ashamed of your own life. The difference matters. What enters repeatedly does not remain external for long. It starts becoming mood, then expectation, then inner language. Then the mind begins speaking to you in a tone that sounds personal, even though part of it was installed by what you kept consuming. That is how influence becomes identity without permission. You scroll for 20 minutes, and suddenly your own life feels smaller. You sit in enough negative conversations and begin expecting disappointment before anything has gone wrong. You keep listening to people who live inside panic, and your own thoughts start rushing more easily. You fill every quiet moment with noise, and after a while stillness begins to feel unnatural, almost threatening. This is not weakness, it is exposure. The mind adapts to what surrounds it, and adaptation is happening even when you are not paying attention. That is why guarding what enters your mind is not about becoming rigid or antisocial. It is about becoming intentional enough to notice what is repeatedly shaping your inner climate. Because inner peace is not only something you create after damage, it is something you protect before damage enters. If you wait until your mind is already flooded, you are always recovering. A wiser life begins earlier. It asks, why do I keep letting in what I already know leaves me unsettled? That question changes a lot. Sometimes the answer is habit, sometimes boredom, sometimes loneliness, sometimes the desire to feel connected. even if the connection is draining. Sometimes you have simply been living with a level of mental noise for so long that it started feeling normal. But normal is not the same as healthy, and familiar is not the same as harmless. There are people whose presence always leaves you more scattered. There is media that always leaves you comparing, craving, or mentally sped up. There are subjects that pull your mind into the same emotional mud every time. Once you know that, continuing without adjustment is no longer innocence. It becomes permission. A quieter mind begins the moment you stop giving easy access to what repeatedly contaminates it. That might mean changing how your mornings begin, because the first tone that enters the mind often stays longer than you think. It might mean refusing to start the day with other people's urgency, news, or digital noise before your own mind has even had a chance to arrive in itself. It might mean letting certain conversations become shorter, lighter, or less frequent because you are tired of carrying their residue afterward. It might mean realizing that not everything informative is helpful, not everything entertaining is harmless, and not everything familiar deserves daily repetition. There is a form of self-respect hidden inside this discipline. You stop treating your mind like an open hallway where anything can walk through. You begin treating it like a place where conditions matter, because they do. If you keep feeding comparison, comparison will start sounding like your own judgment. If you keep feeding agitation, your thoughts will begin arriving with more speed and less depth. If you keep feeding emotional noise, peace will always feel like something you visit briefly instead of something you can actually live inside. And the reverse is just as true. Cleaner inputs create cleaner thought. More silence creates more readable inner movement. Better conversations improve the tone of your private mind. Slower, steadier, more nourishing forms of attention gradually return you to yourself. Not instantly, but clearly enough that you begin noticing the difference. The mind softens faster. It reacts less quickly. It stops looking for stimulation every few minutes. It becomes easier to hear what is actually yours and what was only passing through because the environment kept feeding it. That is the goal here. Not to control every influence perfectly, but to stop living with the kind of carelessness that keeps making peace harder than it needs to be. You do not need a perfect environment. You need a more honest one that gives your mind a better chance of becoming what you say you want it to become. Because what enters repeatedly will eventually speak in your voice. And once it begins speaking in your voice, you may start calling it personality when it was really just prolonged exposure. So, guard the gate earlier, protect the atmosphere, choose more carefully what gets repeated around you, and once you do that, the next step becomes possible. Because even in a cleaner environment, one thing still has to change if the mind is going to become truly quieter. You have to stop obeying the first story it tells. 5. Question the story before you obey it. A quiet mind is not a mind that never reacts. It is a mind that no longer treats its first interpretation like a command. That is where a great deal of unnecessary suffering begins. Not in the event itself, but in the story the mind rushes to build around it before reality has had time to fully speak. A face changes, and the mind says something is wrong. A message arrives late, and the mind says you are being ignored. A plan shifts, and the mind says everything is falling apart. The outer moment may still be small, unclear, or neutral, but the inner narrative arrives quickly, confidently, and with the tone of truth. That tone is what makes it dangerous, because the mind does not usually announce these stories as guesses. It presents them like conclusions. It does not say one possibility is that this person is upset with me. It says they are upset with me. It does not say this setback may be manageable. It says this is going badly. It does not say I am feeling insecure right now. It says something is wrong with me. The speed of that movement matters. The mind closes the gap too quickly between what happened and what it means, and once that meaning is accepted without question, emotion begins rising behind it almost immediately. That is why inquiry matters so much. Not endless analysis, not intellectual overcomplication. Just enough questioning to stop the first story from becoming law inside you. Because many of the stories that create inner noise are not reality at all. They are fear in a convincing voice. They are old wounds trying to interpret the present through the language of the past. They are distortions built from habit, exaggeration, mind reading, personalization, prediction, emotional reasoning. And if you do not interrupt them, they start shaping not only how you feel, but how you behave. Take something ordinary. Someone seems distant for a day. The event is real, but the story is optional. The mind may tell you that you said something wrong, that they are pulling away, that this means the relationship is changing, that you need to fix it now, that silence means rejection. None of that may be true. Yet if you obey the story too quickly, your whole state changes. You get tense, you overthink, you text from anxiety, you stop being natural. And now the story is not just something you believed, it is something you are acting from. That is how noise grows. A quieter mind begins to ask, what are the facts and what has my mind added? That question alone can soften a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Not because it solves every uncertainty, but because it stops imagination from taking the throne too early. You realize that many thoughts arrive wearing the clothes of truth while carrying the instincts of fear. And once you see that clearly, you stop bowing so quickly. This is especially important because the mind is very good at building emotional certainty from incomplete information. It personalizes what may not be personal. It predicts what has not happened. It fills silence with meaning. It turns possibility into destiny. And the more tired, stressed, or emotionally exposed you are, the more persuasive those stories become. That does not mean you are weak. It means the mind is faster when it is unobserved. So the practice is not to become suspicious of every thought in an unhealthy way. It is to become sober enough to pause before turning interpretation into reality. You do not have to believe the first story simply because it arrived first. You can ask, is this true or just familiar? Is this reality or a pattern? What do I actually know right now? What have I added because my mind hates uncertainty? Those questions are not small. They create distance. And distance is where peace becomes possible. Because once you create that distance, you can respond differently. You stop turning one look into rejection. You stop turning one mistake into a verdict. You stop turning one delay into a disaster. You stop turning one feeling into a prophecy. You begin letting reality stay smaller when it is still small. That alone protects enormous amounts of energy. There is a deep maturity in this. You no longer need every uncomfortable thought to be solved immediately. You can let things remain unclear without forcing a dark interpretation onto them. You can live with a little uncertainty without rushing to fill it with self-judgment or fear. That is not passivity. That is self-government. And it changes the atmosphere of your inner life. Because many people are not living under reality as much as they are living under stories about reality that were never questioned enough to lose authority. They keep obeying interpretations that do not deserve that level of trust. Then they call the resulting tension life. But often it is not life. It is an unexamined narrative running too far ahead. So when a thought arrives with urgency, heaviness, or emotional force, slow the process down. Let the story wait. Let reality speak more fully before you hand your state over to what the mind guessed in the first few seconds. Sometimes the story will contain something useful. Sometimes it will warn you well. But many times it will only reveal the speed of your fear, not the shape of the truth. A quieter mind learns the difference. It does not become naive. It becomes slower to conclude. It becomes harder to manipulate from within. It becomes less willing to suffer for events that have not actually happened. And that is one of the cleanest forms of freedom you can build, the freedom to examine before you obey. Because once you stop automatically believing the first interpretation, the relationship you have with yourself begins to change as well. And that matters because peace is very hard to build if the voice inside you remains harsh, unfair, and impatient. 6. Make your inner voice more just. You can tell a lot about the state of a person's inner life by listening to what happens in the few seconds after they make a mistake, because that is where the real relationship with the self reveals itself. Some people make an error and correct it. Others make an error and immediately turn it into an attack. Not just that was careless, but what is wrong with me? Why am I always like this? Why can't I ever get anything right? And once that tone becomes familiar, the mind stops feeling like a place of guidance and starts feeling like a place of punishment. That is one of the quiet reasons peace disappears. A harsh inner voice does not make you stronger. It makes you tense. It makes you afraid to fail, afraid to try, afraid to be seen in progress, afraid to be imperfect in public or in private. It may look like discipline from the outside because harsh people often seem demanding with themselves, but inner cruelty is not the same thing as inner order. Cruelty creates fear. Fear may produce effort for a while, but it rarely produces steadiness. It produces pressure, shame, collapse, and then the familiar cycle of self-attack after every slip. A just inner voice is different. It does not excuse weakness, and it does not lie to protect your comfort. It simply refuses to humiliate you in the name of improvement. It knows how to say, "That was not your best," without turning the moment into a verdict on your whole identity. It knows how to correct without degrading. It knows how to be firm without becoming violent. That is what many people are missing. They think the only alternative to inner harshness is softness without standards, as if the choice were between being cruel to yourself or letting yourself become careless. But there is a third way, and it is much healthier, much stronger, and much rarer. Honest self-government. You do not flatter yourself. You do not collapse on yourself. You tell the truth in a tone that still leaves room for dignity. That tone changes more than people realize. When the inner voice becomes fairer, the body changes with it. You stop living under constant internal threat. Mistakes no longer feel like personal disasters. Effort becomes easier to sustain because it is no longer tied to self-punishment. You recover faster after setbacks because you are not spending half your energy attacking yourself for having them. And over time, the whole mind becomes quieter. Because so much of inner noise was never reality to begin with. It was commentary. Notice how often your mind adds unnecessary cruelty to things that are already difficult. Life is already asking you to face uncertainty, fatigue, loss, awkward moments, and imperfect progress. It does not help when the voice inside you turns each of those into proof that you are failing at being a person. That is not wisdom. It is distortion repeated long enough to sound familiar. A more just inner voice sounds different. It says, slow down, look again, fix what you can, learn what this is showing you, return. It does not deny disappointment, but it does not weaponize it. It does not use one weak moment to erase all the ground you have actually covered. It does not speak as if a setback has the right to define the whole story. And this matters deeply because the voice inside you is always training something. If it keeps training shame, then even your growth will feel stressful. If it keeps training contempt, then your own mind will become a place you unconsciously want to escape. But if it begins training fairness, then correction becomes easier to accept. You stop resisting your own improvement because improvement no longer arrives in the language of humiliation. That is why justice toward yourself is not indulgence. It is stability. A person with a fairer inner voice can still hold standards, In fact, they often hold them better because they are not constantly swinging between harshness and collapse. They can look at reality clearly. They can say, that was weak. That needs to change. I have to do better next time without falling into I am weak, I never change, I always ruin everything. One response creates movement, the other creates paralysis. One is discipline, the other is self-destruction, disguised as honesty. So begin listening for the tone, not only the content. Sometimes the sentence itself is not the deepest problem. The problem is the emotional posture behind it. Is the voice guiding you or cornering you? Is it helping you recover your footing or making the ground disappear under you? Is it telling the truth in a way that strengthens responsibility or in a way that strengthens shame? Those questions matter because a mind cannot become quiet if it is constantly being tried in a hostile court from the inside. Make the voice fairer, not softer than truth, just fairer than habit. Let it correct, but not humiliate. Let it challenge, but not condemn. Let it tell the truth, but not in a way that leaves you smaller than before. Because peace grows when the relationship with yourself stops feeling like conflict. And once that relationship becomes calmer, you begin needing fewer dramatic rescues from your own mind. What you need then are simple ways to return before drift turns into chaos. 7. Build small rituals of return. Peace is rarely lost in one dramatic moment. More often it drifts. Your attention drifts. Your body drifts away from the present. Your thoughts drift into speed, tension, memory, prediction, and then, before you fully notice it, your whole inner state has moved somewhere you never consciously chose. That is why a quiet mind cannot depend on insight alone, because insight may show you the truth, but it does not automatically bring you back when you have wandered from it. You need something simpler, more repeatable, more physical than inspiration. You need ways to return. This is where small rituals matter. Not because they are impressive, and not because they turn life into some carefully staged performance of calm, but because the mind needs bridges back to itself. When you are already mentally scattered, you do not need another big idea. You need an anchor. Something immediate enough to interrupt drift before it becomes a whole mood, a whole reaction, or a whole day. A ritual of return can be very small. One slow breath before answering. A short walk when the mind starts overheating. A page of writing before the noise inside you becomes confusion. A few minutes of silence before sleep, so the day does not continue speaking inside you all night. Looking away from the screen and returning to the body. Pausing long enough to name what is happening instead of being carried by it. These are not decorative habits. They are recovery points. They are the places where the mind remembers that it does not have to keep running. What makes them powerful is repetition. A single pause helps. A repeated pause becomes a path home. That is the difference between admiring peace and actually living in a way that makes peace more likely. Many people understand what calms them, but they do not build it into the structure of their day, so they only return by accident. They wait until they are overwhelmed, then try to recover. A wiser life does not wait so long. It places small returns in advance because it understands that the mind will drift, and that drift is easier to correct early than late. This is why rituals of return should be simple enough to survive real life. If your idea of inner peace depends on perfect conditions, long routines, and a fully controlled schedule, then the first difficult week will break it. But a short walk can survive a hard day. A conscious breath can survive a tense conversation. A few honest lines written in silence can survive a crowded week. These small acts do not ask life to stop being life. They simply stop your mind from disappearing inside it completely. And there is something deeper happening here too. These rituals reconnect the mind to the body, which matters more than people think. A loud mind often floats too far above reality. It lives in anticipation, memory, interpretation, and imagined futures. But the body is always here. The breath is here. The feet are here. The act of writing, walking, sitting still, pausing before speech. All of these bring thought back down into something livable. They remind you that peace is not only an idea to agree with, it is a state to return to physically again and again until it becomes more familiar. This is why return must become a practice, not a rescue. You are not trying to wait until chaos becomes unbearable and then save yourself at the last second. You are training your system to recognize its exits earlier, to know what helps, to know where steadiness lives, to stop treating drift like fate. Because once you have reliable ways to come back, the mind becomes less afraid of its own movement. You stop panicking every time tension rises because you know how to return. That confidence alone makes the inner world quieter. Think about what would change if your day had even 2 or 3 deliberate return points built into it. A cleaner beginning, a brief reset in the middle, a quieter ending, not dramatic, not time-consuming, just enough to stop the mind from accumulating endless residue, enough to prevent reactivity from becoming the default tone of the day, enough to remind you more than once that you can come back before you are completely lost. Because that is the real gift of ritual. It turns peace from something accidental into something more dependable. Not permanent, not perfect, but reachable. And that matters, because once the mind knows how to return, life stops feeling like a force that is always dragging you away from yourself. You begin trusting that even if tension rises, even if distraction wins for a while, even if the day gets messy, you are not trapped there. You can come back. You know how. That is what small rituals protect. Not the illusion of constant calm, but the reality of repeated return. And once you begin living like that, the final truth becomes clear, because inner peace is not one perfect emotional state you manage to hold forever. It is something built through the way you live, day after day, until a quieter mind becomes more likely than the old chaos. 8. Live in a way that makes inner peace. More likely. A quiet mind is not something you win once and then keep forever without effort. It is something your life either supports or quietly undermines every day. That is why inner peace cannot be reduced to a mood, a technique, or one beautiful insight that moved you for an hour. It is built through conditions, through repeated choices, through the kind of life you keep arranging around your attention, your pace, your habits, your inputs, and your responses, until calm stops feeling like a rare visitor and starts feeling more like home. This is where many people get frustrated, because they want peace while continuing to live in ways that make agitation almost inevitable. They want a quieter mind, but they keep feeding it noise. They want steadiness, but they keep honoring urgency. They want emotional clarity, but they keep surrounding themselves with overstimulation, unresolved tension, and habits that make reflection harder than reaction. Then they wonder why peace feels fragile. But peace is fragile when life is built against it. That is why the final shift is not only inward, it is structural. You begin living in a way that makes inner peace more likely. You become more careful with what gets repeated, more honest about what leaves you mentally crowded, more protective of the rhythms that keep you readable to yourself. You stop expecting wisdom to appear in a life that never gives it room to land. And this is where Stoicism becomes something real, something lived, because it stops being an idea you admire and starts becoming a pattern you return to. You notice what is yours and what is not. You act without clinging. You slow your pace enough to think clearly. You guard your inputs. You question the first story. You speak to yourself more justly. You build rituals that return you before drift becomes chaos. Then you do it again tomorrow, and again the day after that, until the quieter mind you wanted stops being a theory and starts becoming the natural result of how you live. That is what people often miss. Peace is not one perfect emotional state. It is repeated alignment. It is the result of enough small decisions made in the right direction that the inner world no longer feels constantly under siege. Life may still be difficult. There will still be uncertainty, disappointment, fatigue, difficult people, and unfinished outcomes. But the interior experience of those things changes when the mind is no longer amplifying them in every direction. You do not need to become someone unreachable, detached from life, or untouched by feeling. You only need to become more governed, more selective, more disciplined in where your mind goes when life becomes difficult. That is what makes peace more durable. Not escape from life, but wiser participation in it. A quiet mind is built the same way anything lasting is built, slowly, repeatedly, and through conditions that support what you say you want. So, if peace matters to you, do not only chase it in moments of desperation. Build a life that stops working against it. Because the mind eventually begins to resemble the way you live. A quiet mind is not the reward for a perfect life. It is the result of a governed inner life. When you stop chasing control where none exists, return to the next right action. Slow your pace. Filter what enters your mind. Question your first interpretations and treat yourself with more justice. Something begins to change. Life may still be difficult, but it stops owning your interior world in the same way. And that is where Stoicism becomes real, not as a quote, not as a philosophy you admire from a distance, but as a way of living that makes peace possible in the middle of ordinary life. So do not try to master everything from this episode at once. Choose one principle that hits you the hardest and begin there. Return to it quietly. Practice it without drama. Let it become part of your way of moving through the day. And if this episode gave you something real, take a second to like the video and write in the comments, "I return to what is mine to govern."